I'm so glad to be here. Congratulations to the James Museum on this splendid Edward S. Curtis exhibit. It's so well written, so well curated. It's an extraordinary achievement, and I'm really honored to be able to come and be part of its inauguration here. I've been working on Edward S. Curtis for a number of years now, and I've had a chance to open a couple of exhibits, one in Scottsdale and now here. Curtis is a very, very interesting artist and ethnographer, and in the last few decades, his work has come under a certain kind of scrutiny, and I want to address some of that today, but I want to set it up a little bit like this. So, of course, here he is. What a beautiful self-portrait from 1908. I created an exhibit for the Theodore Roosevelt Center at Dickinson State University in western North Dakota on Theodore Roosevelt and Curtis, called The Rough Rider and the Shadow Catcher. They had an extraordinary relationship. Among other things, Roosevelt wrote the foreword to Volume 1 of the North American Indian, and that endorsement by none other than Theodore Roosevelt was extremely important in Curtis's success. I'll come back to that. And so this was an exhibit on their long and interesting relationship. Curtis was discovered by the Roosevelt family for a photograph he took of a young woman for Ladies' Home Journal. It was the prettiest baby in America contest. And Curtis didn't win, but he was an honorable mention. And Mrs. Roosevelt, Edith, TR's wife, said, let's get him over here to Sagamore Hill to photograph the children. He photographed the children, and he took a famous photograph of TR, which you see here. George Bird Grinnell and other people who knew Roosevelt well said this is the best photograph ever taken of him. So it's a remarkable story. And then Roosevelt he made a big mistake here. He invited Curtis to be the only photographer for his daughter Alice Roosevelt's wedding in the White House. Curtis was from Seattle. The Eastern establishment didn't like this one bit. Curtis did take some wonderful photographs. It was a disastrous event. Talk about bridezilla. Alice Roosevelt Longworth is one of the most colorful women in American history. She hated the cake. She hated the champagne. She hated her dress. She hated everything. And her long-suffering stepmother, Edith, when Alice and her new husband left in their jalopy, Edith kissed her on the mouth for the first time and said, we're glad you're going, you've been nothing but trouble. But Alice got her revenge. She's the one who later said of TR, my father wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. So this was one of my proud events, and I'd love for this exhibit on TR and and Curtis to do some traveling. Curtis said, I want to make them live forever, Native Americans. It's such a big dream, I can't see it all. And look what he did. Look what he did. He took arguably the most famous photograph of a Native American ever taken, 1903 in his studio in Seattle. That's Chief Joseph of the Nimipu of the Nez Perce. Look at this face. Just look at this face. Joseph was not interested in this photo shoot, but he was trying very hard to get the government of the United States to let him return from Oklahoma to his ancestral home in Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington, and so he sat for that purpose. Look at this achievement. I'm going to double up on some of the things that Shane said, but I think it's worth repeating. Up to 40,000 dry glass plates. Now that may be something of an exaggeration, but it was tens of thousands at the very least. In addition, 8,000 Edison cylinder recordings of sound. Think of that. 20 volumes, the North American Indian, plus 20 volumes of plates. He used motion pictures to try to do docudramas of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge, and also The Little Bighorn. Unfortunately, those films have disappeared. And then, of course, at the end, 1914, the first Native American star drama in the land of the headhunters. Think of this achievement. This is not just a photographer. The ethnography, that is the written anthropology in the 20 volumes, is of great ethnographical importance. It's often ignored because the photographs are so great. But he is also a superb ethnographer. Here he is in old age, colorful jacket, and again, he died penniless. He was living with his daughter Beth and her husband in Hollywood. After all this incredible achievement, there was a 72-word obituary in the New York Times that only mentioned the North American Indian in a single sentence. He was essentially forgotten at the time of his death in 1952. Here it is. Look at this. I too own the knockoff set for $6,500, and it's absolutely beautiful. One of the mistakes they made that Curtis wanted this to be published on the finest paper with the finest presses in existence at the time. Therefore, the copies sold for around $3,500 per set. That's $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 today, and so they could never sell enough, and most of them were remaindered. Wound up in a Boston bookstore's cellar where they were cut up and the images sold individually. But it's a terribly sad story. His sense of perfection was so great that he insisted on the finest paper, the finest ink, the finest copper plates, and that made the series essentially prohibitively expensive for almost everybody. 8,000 to 10,000 cylinder disc recordings, and they exist, many of them, at the University of Indiana. You need special permission to have them, and I'll come back to that later about who owns Native American imagery and sound. He also did essentially a PowerPoint using these lantern slide projectors to try to raise money for the project. He called it his Indian opera. When I use the word Indian, I'm only quoting. Preferred terms are indigenous and Native American and so on. But he called these his Indian picture shows or his Indian operas, and he colorized, as you saw, he colorized many of the photographs. This is a colorized slide. To our way of thinking, they seem garish, but imagine what color felt like at Carnegie Hall in 1907 or 1908, and people were thrilled by the color, and even the more garish ones were the best loved because they were starved for color. All right, so first of all, going back to what Shane said a little while, what is a photograph? So there is a concert, and that's what is a photograph today. Click, 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 click. Curtis would say, no, 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 no. Nope, that is not a photograph. That's a snapshot, and we are lucky to have this technology. But to repeat, and I'll come back to this several times, every Edward S. Curtis photograph was composed. Every photograph was composed. Here's a set of the plates. Imagine traveling all over the American West at a time when the infrastructure was essentially zero. Starting on a train, then going to a wagon, then going to a buckboard, then going to horses and mules, carrying this enormously heavy equipment all over the American West, exceedingly fragile, light sensitive, easily damaged. Take a look at this photograph. This is a really interesting. Here's the finished product. This magnificent sepia image of this elder. You see how he did it? He has his backdrop. These photographs are taken in a tent, probably in 90, 100, 105 degree weather. He set up the backdrop, and then he used the flaps on the tent to let in the amount of light that he wanted. Then he set up the person. The person would choose what he or she wanted to wear. In only a handful of cases did Curtis supply what he called costuming or regalia. And then only because there was no choice. The person had no traditional regalia to wear, so Curtis carried a little kit of it for people who needed it, but typically the person wore what she or he wanted to wear, and then Curtis would say, stand through an interpreter, stand as you would like to stand, and they would negotiate this, and then he would work the flaps, and then of course through an interpreter say, now stand perfectly still for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, whatever it was, and then the result after the work in the darkroom is this magnificent portrait. But this is the raw file from which this magnificent portrait was made. Every photograph that Curtis took was composed. And these are the conditions. One of these is his tent, carrying his equipment out into the middle of nowhere in the American West. And then after he spent from, say, April 15th until September 1st in the field with the Apache, with the Comanche, with the Shoshone, with the Nez Perce, with the Lakota, with the Hidatsa, with the Assiniboine. Then, instead of going home to Seattle, where he had a family and a long-suffering wife, he would take his crew of about 4, and they would find a lonely cabin somewhere with no connection to a telephone to write up the summer's work, because his view was, if we go home without writing up the work, it'll never get written up. So his poor long-suffering wife sees him leave in April, finally finishes his field work in September, then doesn't come home until December or late November, stays a few days, gets on a train, and goes to New York to raise money. She divorced him in a celebrated, horrible public divorce, deeply humiliating to him, but she was right. I'm Team Clara. He was never there. He was never there. He sacrificed everything for this project. He took no money himself. He borrowed against his studio, which was a prominent portrait studio in Seattle. He borrowed money from all of his friends until they gave up lending him money. He was always in arrears. His children were, in many respects, alienated from him because he was never home. And his wife finally said, "That's it, I'm done." And when he came back from a trip to the British Columbia, he was arrested at the port of Seattle for debt. This is late in the game. When he went in to see the judge the next day, the judge said, "How can you be broke? You're the most famous photographer in America." And Curtis said, "Well, I've never taken any money myself for any of my work." And the judge said, "What's wrong with you? You got to take care of yourself." But he didn't, and so imagine him. Imagine Clara waiting for him when he's in here writing up the summer. Here are the challenges. Money, never enough. Opposition by missionaries who despised any attempt to depict Native Americans in traditional ways. Opposition by government assimilationists, I'll come back to that. In many cases, tribal resistance. The critique of the experts. Franz Boas of Columbia University denounced him because he wasn't credentialed properly in anthropology. The pressure of a failing and troubled marriage, the wear and tear of primitive travel. Cameras were shattered when they fell off cliffs. Here's what he said in 1904, just getting started. In the beginning, I had no thought of making the series large enough to be of any value for the future, but the thing has grown so that I now see its great possibilities, and certainly nothing could be of greater value. The only question now in my mind is, will I be able to keep the thing long enough? And steady work, as doing it in a thorough way, is enormously expensive. And more challenges. The financial panic of 1907 was the worst financial panic until the Great Depression in American history. His patron, J.P. Morgan, died in 1913 in Rome. World War I prevented paper from being manufactured and distributed, etc. Theodore Roosevelt, his great champion, died on January 6, 1919 on Long Island. Then came the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. The fact that he finished this at all is astounding. It's astounding that he persevered through all of this. And 3 or 4 times, especially around the time of World War I and the death of TR, he basically decided to pack it in. But then he regrouped, got a little sleep, and went back to work. Think of that. Think of the sacrifice. I think it's fair to say that this human being sacrificed his life for this achievement. Would you? Would I? No way. Here we see him at work in Canyon de Chelly. Now this man probably doesn't wear a headdress on Tuesdays. You know, that's one of the raps against Curtis from time to time. Of course, this is one of the most famous photographs he ever took, Canyon de Chelly, right? How many of you have been there? Oh my, if you ever get the chance. This is an extraordinarily beautiful photograph. I'm going to show you two AI images. I apologize. But I want you to get a sense of how this was composed, because as Shane was saying, this is not a snapshot. He's not wandering around Canyon de Chelly saying, look at the horsemen. This is established. Dog, 4 here, 3 here, gap between. This doesn't just happen. This is the kind of camera we're talking about. I've seen a photograph from another place of this. He almost certainly has a director's cone, like, go back and start over. More distance between you. Make sure we can see the dog. The light's not right. This is an incredibly important photograph that we're fortunate to have. And anyone who thinks you could take that with a 35mm camera or any other camera has not thought it through. Composed. Here it is today. The trees, the cottonwoods have grown up so you can't see it anymore. And here's the gold tone. Let me just say a word about the gold tones. This is a banana wash. It's not actually gold, but he pioneered this. He also called it Curtis tones, Kurt tones. You'll see 2 of them upstairs. When you go up to look at them, duck down and look up from below, because when you look up from below, they pop into a 3D. He pioneered this. These are among his most precious products. And the gold tones, these are his frames also. The gold tones are as close as we get to kind of a 3-dimensional portrait as we can, given the technologies of the time. Again, just look at that photograph. Takeaway, not a snapshot. All right. One patron, one friend. Here's the patron, J.P. Morgan. You probably know the story. He talked to Roosevelt, who was his friend because of the thing he did at Oyster Bay. Roosevelt said, I have no friends among the rich. They all hate me, but I'll do what I can. So he wrote a letter of introduction, and Curtis got an appointment with J.P. Morgan. Well, J.P. Morgan was a horrible man, did not suffer fools, didn't like to give away his money, didn't want to see Curtis, but Curtis somehow weaseled his way in, and he sat in front of the great J.P. Morgan and said, I want you to support my project. And Morgan said, sorry, I'm not interested, please leave. And Curtis said, I'm not leaving till you look at the portfolio. I will not leave until you at least look at the portfolio. And Morgan, rolled his eyes and did. He saw this photograph of Mosa, a Mojave girl, Mojave young woman, and he said, you did this? Can you do more of this? I'll support you. And he gave him $15,000 a year for 5 years, which was nothing. It was the total $75,000. Probably it was a fifth or a sixth of the actual cost of the project. And Morgan's son, Jack, gave him more money later. But that was the money that made it possible. And Morgan said, I like a man who attempts the impossible. Here's the photo he took, the gold tone of the photo he took of TR. TR loved it, and so did Curtis. My picture of the president is great. It is quite different from anything before taken, and I believe will be considered by all who know him a splendid likeness. I made no effort to retouch up the face or make him smooth-visaged without a line or anything to show character. This is the foreword that Roosevelt wrote, a beautiful foreword to the first volume of the North American Indian. You can read it online anytime. And then at the University of Washington, where I've done research on Curtis, a lot of his archives of his papers are there. This is one of his typescripts about his meeting, this historic first meeting with the Roosevelts. Roosevelt's grasp of the project's importance to the history of our country and to students and scientists of the world was greater than I had envisioned. Bully for you, Curtis. I don't think he said bully. I believe you are the man that can do it. I will give you every assistance within my power for the accomplishment of so great an undertaking. So it never hurts to have TR on your side. And maybe you heard, but Shane, the new Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library is going up in western North Dakota. It'll be opening on the 4th of July, 2026, out in Medora in the Badlands. About time that TR gets a presidential library. There's a lot of interesting backstory to that, but Shane has been asked to provide photographs for the cafeteria, and so Shane's work will be there, and Roosevelt, who was not altogether friendly to Native Americans, but nevertheless wanted to preserve their culture, I think would be pleased. All right, So here, I'm going to just repeat something that Shane said. Can we really be serious that we wish Curtis had not taken those 40,000 glass plate photographs? Can we really be serious? A few are. I'm a Jefferson scholar. Here's an analog. Can we really want to discredit the Declaration of Independence just because Jefferson was a slaveholder? Of course not. The achievement stands for itself. We can quibble about some things with Jefferson and with Curtis, but look, again, Joseph, Red Cloud a year before his death on the Pine Ridge. Curtis had to work hard to get permission to photograph Red Cloud. Look at that ancient, magnificent face. Red Cloud said, you know, you white men make many promises. You never keep any. Well, actually, you kept one. You said you would take our land, and you did. Red Cloud won the only war against the United States by Native Americans. The Red Cloud's War, the Powder River War of 1868. Geronimo. Look at this. This is an Arikara man, bear's belly. Look at that image. Can we really wish he hadn't done this? And this is one of my very favorites. This is Eagle Catcher, and again, Shane comically said, no snapshot here. But I've talked to Gerard Baker, who's an elder of the Hidatsa, for a project, the Elders Project that I'm doing, and I'll try to have a moment to explain that. He talked about this photograph. He knows where in the Killdeer Mountains, and in North Dakota when we say mountain, we mean a little hill. He knows where in the Killdeer Mountains this photograph was taken. He knows what, these were red stockings. Earlier times, this man would have painted his legs red, but by now not. This eagle is not something that's a prop. This is an eagle catcher. This is his vocation. And you don't just become an eagle catcher, you have to train, you have to work with an elder, you have to work as an apprentice, you have to earn the right. This man, Gerard Baker, who is an extraordinary elder of the Hidatsa, explained every piece of this, how he came to be even entitled to be photographed with an eagle, and the way the eagle had to hang. It's just an absolutely magnificent photograph. At the end of his career, after all this time, after all these troubles, Curtis did some work in Alaska, and mostly he was alone out there, but on this occasion his daughter Beth went with him. This is Curtis and his daughter Beth. And they had some wild adventures in the Aleutians and in the Bering Sea. But he went here to Nunavak, and he took this photograph, and it's so interesting because Liz Russ, who's going to speak next, is the granddaughter of this woman. She's here today, the granddaughter of this woman. And this is one of the handful of photographs taken by Edward S. Curtis of natives smiling. One of the handful of photographs. And here's what he said about it. Think of it, at last. And for the first time in all my 30 years of work with natives, I have found a place where no missionary has worked. And he said, should any misguided missionary start for this island, I trust the sea will do its duty. Well, Liz can tell you they got there, and white diseases, white habits, white, the whole problem of intersection of cultures and colonialism did come to that part of the world. But when Curtis was there with his daughter Beth, he was able to see this. And the photograph upstairs is just absolutely magnificent and in much higher resolution than this print. All right, so I want to address this question for a moment. Curtis, like almost all other white people of his time, believed that Native Americans were going to go extinct. One of two things was going to happen. Either they were going to be absorbed, fully assimilated, and they would be like Irish Americans or Italian Americans or Slavic Americans, or they would simply die out. But it was widely thought, almost universally felt in the white world, that it was only a matter of time before there were no Indians, there were no native people left, or those that had ethnic nativity would be so thoroughly absorbed that you might see them at a powwow, the way you see St. Patrick's Day in the spring, but there would be no distinct Native American communities in America. This was universally held. The population of American Indians in 1900 was down to 230,000. Think of this. Maybe 20 million at the time of Columbus. So these anthropologists and policymakers were not just making stuff up when they said it's almost over for Native Americans. One of the most astonishing facts is that Native Americans would not permit themselves to be extinguished. They've hung on, they've come back, they're in resurgence. There's a Native American cultural renaissance going on. In my North Dakota, the most rapidly growing population is Native Americans. Mandan, Arikara, Hidatsa, Lakota, Dakota, Ojibwe, Assiniboine. The most rapidly increasing population in North Dakota is Native Americans. And I can tell you as a really proud North Dakotan that we are blessed to have a heavy Native population in North Dakota. It complicates everything in a wonderful way. It complicates everything in a kind of John Lewis way. That you cannot any longer do things in the white dominant community in North Dakota without having Native Americans at the table. And boy, did North Dakota learn its lesson from the pipeline controversy of a few years ago. I'm blessed to live in such a place. And when I think of places like Texas or Kansas, which did everything in their power to remove all natives forever, I see an impoverished culture. What is the American West without the indigenous people who shaped those landscapes, who understood them in a way that we don't yet, and who always bring something extraordinary and complicating to the table? So they were just wrong. But here's Roosevelt. You have begun just in time, for these people are at this very moment rapidly losing the distinctive traits and customs which they have slowly developed through the ages. Here's what natives were up against at this moment. The Indian Crimes Code of 1883, I'll return to it in a moment. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 that forced natives to homestead their own tribal lands, and if they didn't homestead them all, they were called surplus lands and divvied up amongst whites. Offer reservation boarding schools, we've all been hearing a lot about that. Rations, coercions. If you want your rations, you must comply. Otherwise, we'll withhold rations from you. First, we make you utterly dependent on the rations. Then we have conditions under which those rations can be distributed. The Indian Religious Crimes Code of 1883, that's the year, by the way, that Theodore Roosevelt first came to the Badlands of North Dakota to ranch and hunt. It banned the sun dance. It banned the ghost dance, which came a little later. It banned potlatches, feasts, and giveaways. It banned vision quests, sweat lodge ceremonies, healing dances. It banned medicine men and traditional healers. It banned polygamy and marriages done in traditional ways. It essentially tried to crush Indian culture, Native culture, out of Native American populations along the lines of Richard Pratt, who created the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, and his motto, and I'm quoting, was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Kill the Indian in order to save the man. This was what Curtis was up against. He was committing crimes when he took photographs of Native traditions. And the natives who participated in those photographs were committing crimes under the Indian Crimes Code. The missionaries and the agents were uniformly grim with respect to Curtis's achievement. So when he says a vanishing race, we realize that's not true. But we also need to understand that it rang true at the time, and part of what made him persevere through all those difficulties was his belief that if he didn't get this down, it would never, ever be captured on film. Now this famous photograph, The Vanishing Race, is one of his most extraordinary. It was the lead photograph in the 20 volumes. He took it in Canyon de Chelly. There's a great backstory. You know, when I worked with Shane in his great studio that you saw, we go in immediately after he takes an image and he develops it, and you can watch him in the darkroom as he develops it. It's magical. When Curtis took photographs, he wasn't sure. Sometimes he had to wait weeks before he could develop the image. He actually got back to Seattle with this one, and it was radically underdeveloped, underexposed. And so it was actually useless. Any other photographer probably would have just ditched it and gone on. But with this, I can take 72 images in 2 minutes. He gets to take 1 or 2. So now what? So he worked with Adolf Muir, his darkroom genius, a German chemist, and they worked for an entire weekend, stayed up both nights over a weekend to try to get something out of this badly exposed image, and they got this, and look what they got. Look what they got, the shadows. This person, this is not a very clear picture, you can see it upstairs, this person looking back, the natives heading into an uncertain future. He decided this was the image, and this is what he said. Shane had it too. The thought which this picture is meant to convey is that the Indians, as a race already shorn of their tribal strength and stripped of their primitive dress, are passing into the darkness of an unknown future, feeling that the picture expresses so much of the thought that inspired the entire work. The author, I, Curtis, has chosen is the first of the series. So the myth of the vanishing Indian, excuse that language, the myth of the vanishing Indian was so universal at the time that this became a fundraising photograph for his work. And you all know this, the famous End of the Trail statue, which is in Oklahoma. Here's James Earl Fraser, the great sculptor who did it. And when he did it, he's a South Dakotan, by the way, when he did it, he wanted this, if you can imagine it, he wanted this to be on the coast of the Pacific near Santa Monica, so that the native was literally leaving the continent, bent over, defeated, the horse defeated. I'm sure you know this is one of the most widely reproduced of all images of Native Americans. You see it everywhere. You see it at powwows, you see it at rodeos, you see it on belt buckles, you see it on posters, you see it in commercial ads for tobacco. This is almost the #1 image that the American people of our time privilege as an image of Native America. And you can see, from a white point of view, it's mixed, it's triumphalist, they're gone now. But it's also a certain kind of sadness, a nostalgia, a romanticization of loss, nobility in loss. It's a very complicated trope, and not a very healthy one in some respects. The assimilation of Alexander Upshaw. This is a story that haunts me. There's an image of him upstairs, by the way. This is Alexander Upshaw. He's at Soroka, that's Crow. And he went to Carlisle Indian School, and he was remade into a white man's Indian. Kill the Indian, save the man. He actually gave his senior speech about how grateful natives should be for white supervision as they entered a more civilized state. Curtis found him in Billings. He was a kind of a cultural liaison for the Absaroka, for the Crow. He worked with Alexander Upshaw, and that of course would not have been his birth name, for a number of years. And then he convinced Upshaw to put on this regalia to be photographed. And I have very complicated feelings about this photograph. I don't know about you. But think of the cultural coding. We want you to cease to be Indian, so we'll dress you like this, cut off your hair, beat you if you use your native language, beat you if you profess native religion. We will teach you white person's rudimentary skills like blacksmithing and carpentry and so on. And we expect you now to be sort of a probationary white person. And then Curtis says, yeah, would you dress up in your native regalia? And you can see I think you can see some real ambivalence on the face of Upshaw. It's such an amazing story. So Curtis, as I said, did these reenactments of Wounded Knee and the Little Bighorn. He got some Crow Scouts who had been with Custer. These are the Crow Scouts that had been with Custer. And there's Curtis and there's Upshaw. And they're at the Little Bighorn. And they followed it in real time from ridge to ridge and moment to moment. And the Crow Scouts said, look, Custer was a schnook. He left Reno to die on the other ridge. And Curtis wrote to Theodore Roosevelt and said, do I dare publish that? And Roosevelt said, no. You don't want to deal with Libby Custer, Custer's widow, who protected his reputation for the rest of her life. They did this. And then, if you can imagine it, when TR was about to retire in 1909, so last weeks of his presidency, Curtis took Upshaw to Washington to meet the president. And Upshaw said, we have some real problems out on the Crow Reservation, Mr. President. We'd like you to look into it. Roosevelt said, I'm out, I'm heading on safari in Africa, but Taft, he'll take care of it. As you can expect, nothing came of it, but it gets so much worse, and I'm sorry to even have to say this. A year later, was found dead in a jail cell in Billings, having been beaten to death on the streets of Billings. And you know why? He married a white woman. And that was going a little too far on assimilation. I find this story just so haunting and appalling and icky and compelling. I'm trying to write about it. I'm trying to find Absaroka descendants of Upshaw to learn his actual name and much more about his life, and then, of course, his death. So quickly, then, the critique of Edward Curtis. This is what AI did the other night. I just thought I'd see what AI had to say about it. And be skeptical, everyone. It said, setting the scene, Curtis often staged his photographs to fit his romanticized vision, instructing subjects to remove modern clothing or items and so on. That's really, really overstated. Really, really desperately overstated. Here's the critique. Number one, he occasionally brought costumes, a handful, very few, but if the native did not have something to wear that seemed pre-white domination, Curtis would say, well, I happen to have a trunk here. Number two, he paid, like all ethnographers, he paid his informants something. On one or two occasions, he raised the financial offers to the point where the Native American simply couldn't refuse. They were so desperate for money that he kind of coerced them into cooperating. He manipulated a few of his subjects. He would say to Shane, if you won't let me photograph you, I'm going to photograph your rival in the next clan, and he'll become famous and you'll be forgotten. He did that occasionally, not much. On at least two occasions, he intruded into sacred realms where he had no business. That's the most important of these. I'll come back to it. And of course, he subscribed to the myth of the vanishing Indian. So just this about the sacred. So among the Apache, he was told by people at the Smithsonian, the Apache have no religion, which was the standard orthodox view of the Eastern establishment at the time. He said that can't be true. All natives have really deep, complex religious lives. So he went and he found a man in the Apache world named Goshone. And Goshone was what we would call a medicine man, and he would go every morning to pray by the side of a river. And Curtis would stay in a tribal community for weeks at a time, hauling wood, helping with water, doing small tasks to try to win some legitimacy and some support, some credibility, before he ever took a photograph. He would often wait 4, 5, 6 weeks before he took his first image. He wanted to earn the right to do so. And he and one of his aides crept up on Goshone praying a few days, and finally they sprang out and said, you've got to tell us all about your religion. Goshone was appalled at this violation of his privacy. He's praying, but they convinced him to go ahead and cooperate, and then he deconstructed, he interpreted this sacred piece of buckskin. The minute Goshone had finished it, he came to Curtis the next day and said, I shouldn't have done that. It was a terrible mistake. Please destroy all that. Curtis said, no, I can't do that. Goshone then came back a day or so later and said, I've talked to other elders, I will die soon now. And he died a few months later. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. But he begged Curtis not to reveal this, and Curtis did. My words are on the white man's paper, and I cannot take them back. My life will be short. All the medicine men have said it. When Curtis heard this, he said, well, he was concerned, of course, but he said it's probably a coincidence. And then the sacred turtles of the Mandan. So I'm not going to show you the image. Here's the image. I put a curtain over it. Because when I was doing this work, I'm working on this elders project where I am interviewing native elders of all ages, and they interpret specific Curtis images and also Curtis's overall achievement, especially among their own tribes. When I was interviewing Gerard Baker, the great Hidatsa leader, about this, I showed him this image, and he said, no. I ask you never, ever to show that image in public, not in an exhibit, not in a lecture, never, never. I said, well, you know, it's on Google. You know, you can see it any day you want in high res. He said, that doesn't matter. I'm asking you never, ever to show this image. And of course I agreed. Here's what happened. Curtis learned about this through Alexander Upshaw. Upshaw was his guide. They went to the man who was the keeper of the sacred turtle effigies, the bundle, and they worked with him for weeks, and finally they paid him enough money so that he reluctantly agreed to let Curtis take pictures. They occurred in a remote cabin on the reservation. They had to come surreptitiously. They set a watch outside to see if others would come and interrupt this. The turtles are beautiful, leather-covered, stuffed medicine turtles, and they had feathers. There were a whole series of feathers on top, and Curtis took a bunch of photographs of that, and he said, as long as we're at it, would you remove the feathers? And the man agreed, and now we have both the picture with the feathers and the picture of the naked turtles. When they're finishing, a group of other natives came riding up on horses, and there was all this crisis, and they had to lie about what they had done. So when Gerard Baker, a Hidatsa, says, please do not ever display that photograph, that violates the very basis of the sacred amongst us. I don't see how you can reasonably refuse that. And so these are a couple of instances of where this happened in Curtis. We understand his desire to get it all down before it was too late. We understand that ethnographers routinely paid and sometimes manipulated. We understand that even John Wesley Powell, the great Four Corners ethnographer, took costumes with us at times because he wanted to have the regalia that natives that say Paiute, who didn't have such regalia, could dress in so that others would be impressed by this. And so Curtis is by no means alone in any of this, including up until today, but still it's disquieting. So here's my suggestion. From here on, I would say no Curtis exhibit hereafter should be mounted without significant indigenous advice, commentary, interpretation, and programming. Period. And I have no criticism of what is being done here. None. But I'm saying in the future, for the work that I'm doing and the work of people that I know like Tim Peterson, who is a Curtis collector, that no exhibit hereafter should be mounted without significant indigenous advice, commentary, interpretation, and program, and veto power over certain images. And number two, an effort should be made to identify the descendants of as many of Curtis's images as possible and to consult them about the proper use, exhibition, interpretation of his photographs. And this is sort of the most recent work that NAGPRA is doing with native remains and sacred objects, and there's no reason why this shouldn't be extended to work of this sort. This complicates everything. I get it. But it seems to me that we must do this. And I have a friend who's the research executive at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, and they are working now with something called CARE. This is a set of new standards being produced by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And CARE stands for collective benefit. Everything must be done to make sure that the indigenous people are also benefiting from it in every way, culturally and otherwise. Authority of control, there must be permission. There must be explicit permissions for use. There's a responsibility not to show the sacred turtle effigies, not to play the sacred songs that are still digitized and available at the University of Indiana site, and ethics about how you work with Native people. This is really going to change everything and complicate it, but it seems to me it's absolutely necessary that we move into this direction and immediately. And so I'm so glad that we have a distinguished Native American here to come in and correct all the errors that I've made and that Shane has made and set us right, because it would have been a travesty to do this today without indigenous commentary. And I feel very much vulnerable in pursuing this project in the way that I am. I think that we do need this. If I can complete my project, we'll have more than 70 interviews with Native elders from 7 regions around the country, commenting on individual Curtis images and commenting on his overall achievement. And those will be available in exhibits with QR codes, so that when you look at a picture of something, then you can see the indigenous person saying, well, now, today we don't do this anymore, but this is how we made pottery in 1907 or whatever it is, but there should always be an indigenous voice available, at least for every exhibit, and where possible for every image in that exhibit. So I feel very strongly about that, and I know that it's controversial, but it seems to me we've reached this point and we mustn't turn back. So thank you very much.